Good evening, I'm Mike Knetter, and welcome to the 100th edition of our UW Now Livestream. In March of 2020, I didn't expect we'd ever be saying those words. Our primary goal in creating this was to help keep our alumni and friends connected to UW during the pandemic. We learned a lot about that, and we realized virtual alumni events have a lot of advantage even in normal times. So what developed was really an important connection between faculty, staff, alumni experts, and you, our viewers. I'd like to give a big shout out to our production team who really initiated this idea that has sustained this connection for over 4 years and now 100 episodes. Party to follow. But tonight we are returning to 3 guests whose expertise remains timely and important. They've been on the show before, and we're going to cover tonight electoral politics, the economy, and COVID-19. It's been an incredible summer of political twists and turns, and we have one of the best with us tonight to discuss the 2024 campaign. Former UW and current Marquette Law School professor Charles Franklin will share his latest Wisconsin polls, which were just in the field in early August. And he will help answer what might we expect as we head between now and November. The economy will likely stay top of mind for Americans, both in terms of their wallets and at the ballot box. And with us tonight is UW alum and economist Dana Peterson of the Conference Board. She is our most frequent UW Now Livestream guest. She'll once again dive deep into what's ahead for inflation, the job market, and what the Fed may do as experts still question whether we might be headed into a recession. And then finally, we'll talk to our very first live stream guest and 2-time Badger, Dr. Nassia Safdar. COVID cases are surging once again, and we even saw athletes competing with COVID during the Olympics. What are the lessons from how the world has handled this virus, and how has it prepared us for the future? So it's going to be an exciting show with a lot to unpack, and I'm looking forward to hearing from our viewers on what their questions are for our 3 distinguished guests. So let's get started with Charles, who's going to dive into politics and the landscape we're looking at in Wisconsin and even nationwide since the seismic changes to this race in the last month. Charles, thanks for taking the time. I know you're a busy guy. You're always busy, but during election season, I know how amped up it gets for you. So we really appreciate having you on our show.
I appreciate it. I enjoy being on, and I'm happy to help anything with UW that I can help with. So this is perfect for me. I was waiting for a question there, but I guess I'm not going to get one, so I'll launch from here. This is the 100th episode of the show, and coincidentally, last week we released our 101st Marquette Law School poll. That's 80 polls of Wisconsin and 21 national polls that we've done since 2012. The findings are very interesting because so much has happened over the last not quite 7 weeks. It's hard to remember that it was slightly less than 7 weeks ago that we had the presidential debate. We went through a period, and then we had an assassination attempt. We had the Republican convention held in Milwaukee. We had President Biden drop out of the race, and Kamala Harris very quickly consolidate Democratic support. And now next week, we have the Democratic National Convention. And then finally, we're past that and off to the November election. Our new poll of Wisconsin found that we see a still very close race in Wisconsin. Before the debate, our last poll was in June, released the day before the debate, actually. We had a 50-50 race with registered voters, and with likely voters, Biden had a 2-point advantage. Then the debate happened, and we didn't poll in the interim, but other polling in the state by other organizations showed Trump taking about a 3 or maybe 3.5 point lead in the state. Then Biden drops out, and our poll that started interviewing the week after he dropped out found again a very tight race, 50-49 for Trump with registered voters, and 50 to 49 for Harris with likely voters. And when you include the third party candidates, that bumps it up to a 2-point Harris lead. So, in one sense, nothing changed. It was a very close race in June. It's very close here in August. But in what happened in the meantime was dramatic change. And what we see in our new poll is that views of the candidates changed because Harris is not Biden. And so the issue of age, which had dogged Biden so much, is a non issue for Harris, but actually a bit more of one for Trump, where 59% say Trump is too old to be president. Now only 12% say that of Harris, but 76% said it of Biden. So that's a pretty sharp change. Harris also does a bit better than Trump and better than Biden on cares about shares your values. And that shift remains to be seen whether it will last or what its impact will be. Her favorability ratings went up just a little bit, so that she's in better shape now than she was in June. But she's not particularly stronger than Trump in our Wisconsin data. They bounced up a little more in the national data, by the way. But she's still doing better than Biden was doing in June, or for that matter, how Biden is doing in August. So that shift has taken place. Donald Trump, though, also got a little bit of a boost from the assassination attempt and then the Republican convention, with his favorability rating moving up a little bit, his retrospective job approval as president also going up just a little bit. But the biggest change I would point to is enthusiasm about the election and about voting. We saw throughout the year, through June, enthusiasm this year running between 15 and 20 points lower than it was in the comparable months in 2020. This month, it's popped up to now equal to the 2020 levels. And for Democrats, it went up a full 20 points. Republicans and independents both went up 7 points. So they rose in enthusiasm as well, but Democrats more so. And Democrats, having trailed Republican enthusiasm all year long, is now basically equal to Republicans on that. And so the rest of the campaign looks like those two parties are starting off basically equally involved in the campaign, equally engaged in it, something that was decidedly not the case through June. We have some other things that may shift, but really haven't. If you ask people what are their top issues for the election, it's the economy, which we'll get to in a little bit. It's immigration and it's abortion policy, and Medicare and Social Security gets some attention too. Other issues much less, including foreign affairs, the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza. But what we do see is that who's better on those issues didn't change very much. Trump is seen as better on the economy, on immigration, and on the Israel-Hamas war. Harris, like Biden before, is seen as better on abortion policy, Medicare and Social Security, and health care. It does look like Harris's advantage is a little bigger than Biden's on those three issues, but Trump still maintains his sizable lead on the three issues that he's seen as better. Now, that's where the campaign might play a role and potentially shift things as we go forward. And Mike, I want to throw it back to you and see if there are things you want me to focus on and come back to.
Well, one thing I would love to hear from you, Charles. Harris has obviously gathered a lot of momentum since taking the baton from Biden. Yet there's still 12 weeks to go. She may, in fact, get yet another bump from the convention. But she and her running mate are, in some sense, a bit new. to the national stage, and certainly new to the spotlight they're going to be under for the next 12 weeks. So it seems to me that there's maybe a little bit more risk on the Democratic side of the ticket. I think people know what they're signing up for with the Republican side of the ticket, but maybe there's some surprises, good or bad, for the Democratic ticket. How do you see that playing out in the next 12 weeks?
Indeed. Harris has had an unusually good 3 going on 4 weeks since Biden's withdrawal. She's held major events. She's coalesced the party behind her. Incidentally, in our data, 92% of Democrats say they're satisfied with her as the nominee. Before Biden dropped out, there was talk of an open convention, but that fell by the wayside very rapidly. But if people are only marginally aware of Harris and her positions, they're completely blank on Tim Walz, the vice presidential candidate. Now, both campaigns are rushing to fill that void in both cases, to sketch out the images of both of those candidates, and for that matter, J.D. Vance on the Republican side. The Democratic convention next week will surely be the next step in that. But once that convention is over and we've got all of September and all of October plus a few days, then I think each campaign will make its points and take the incoming fire from the other side. And we could certainly see opinions change over that period. The Harris campaign, as I said, has had a really good 3.5 weeks. But virtually no campaign has nothing but good weeks. So what's going to happen when we see her have a bad week? And how do people feel about this race, especially here in Wisconsin, which is one of the 6 critical swing states for the outcome in the Electoral College? We have a real question about how close this race is and how easily it could tip to one side or the other with a particularly bad week for a campaign, or maybe a particularly good week.
Another quick question before we go to Dana Peterson on the economy. It seems like Trump and Harris will in fact have a debate. I've heard a lot of people express a lot of confidence about Harris on a debate footing, and I expect that she would perform better than Joe Biden. On the other hand, I've watched Donald Trump debate plenty over the years, and he seems to have come out on top in almost every debate I've seen. Initially, I guess I'd say to my surprise, but how do you feel about a Trump-Harris debate, and how do you see that affecting the race?
Sure. Trump is a very combative debater, and I think candidates on the other side have struggled to find the right way to respond to that combativeness. I think that was a big challenge for Hillary Clinton in 2016. The first Biden-Trump debate was when when Trump had COVID during the debate and was really not as strong as he usually is. But he came back to the second debate with a much stronger performance. In the first debate this year, Biden was so unable to really drive the debate that I don't think we got much of a story from that. Harris had some not terribly good debates when she ran for president in 2019 and then dropped out. She had a perfectly credible debate against Mike Pence in 2020. But aside from those few glimpses of her, I don't think we have a whole lot of direct evidence about how she'll perform. This is the case where apparently we'll at least have the debate on ABC. Maybe we'll have another. That still seems up in the air. But I think as long as the race remains very tight, especially in the swing states, that'll put a lot of pressure on both campaigns to consider doing additional debates. At least one campaign will think they need them. Maybe both campaigns will.
Would you advise both of the candidates to pursue a second debate if you were their political advisor?
Well, that's a trickier question. As a citizen, I want more debates. I want people to hear the candidates standing there unaided by notes and say what they say and let the public judge for themselves who's the more coherent and the more persuasive candidate. Um, if I were a purely political advisor, then I would be cautious and I would probably read the tea leaves and say, do I have anything to gain by doing an additional debate? And if the answer is no, then the prudent advisor says, well, let's just reduce our risk here. But those are very different perspectives between wanting the public to know and wanting your candidate to be protected if you can.
Great, thank you. Well, Charles, we'll come back to audience questions shortly. If you don't mind waiting in our virtual green room, I'd like to bring Dana Peterson in. Obviously, the state of the U.S. economy will be a major influence on the presidential race, and more immediately, what happens with both inflation and interest rates will matter to the pocketbooks of all Americans. Dana Peterson of the Conference Board, their chief economist, is with us tonight and will share an overview of what she'll be watching in the coming months. Thank you for joining us again, Dana. You've extended your lead as our most frequent guest.
Thanks so much, Mike. It's great to be here. So, a big question is the US falling off of a cliff? My short answer is probably not. I'll talk about growth, which is through the second quarter has been fine. We'll get some more data this week on the economy in terms of retail sales. Labor markets are not as robust as they were, but we've gone from raging to healthy. So labor markets are actually responding to the Fed's policies. And when it comes to inflation, inflation is still slowing. And we do expect that it'll get back to 2% in the middle of 2025. In terms of the Fed policy path, the Fed is not panicking right now, although the Fed is saying it's watching the labor market for any signs of material slowing. But for the most part, the Fed has been saying the economy is okay. There are certainly risks on both sides, the upside and downside. And most likely they're going to start cutting rates in September. All right, so let's go on this journey. I'm going to show you a bunch of charts. Okay, next slide, please. So here's US real GDP growth. So the line is the annualized percent change in the quarter. And so in the second quarter, the US economy grew by 2.8%. That was stronger than what markets were anticipating. And if you look at the red and the navy blue bars, that's consumer spending. So those two bars together are still pretty robust. Now, consumers are spending a little bit less on services, and the types of services that they're spending on are more things that they need rather than things they want. But even still, we expect that consumer spending is going to slow um, over the course of the second half of this year, but we probably will not go into recession. Next slide, please. When we look at consumer spending, there are some problems. Consumers are spending more than their income. So the light blue line is spending, and the dark blue line, that's after tax income after adjusting for inflation. So if we go to the next slide, we can see that the excess savings that consumers had from the pandemic stimulus has run out. It's gone. Nonetheless, we can see in those charts that consumers are still spending. So how are they doing this? If we go to the next slide, we'll see that. Yes, they're using debt. They're using their credit cards. And with that, so the light blue line, that's how much they're paying in interest. So interest is really adding up, and it accelerated certainly when the Fed started raising interest rates. So we are seeing those issues. And if you go to the next slide, we can see that consumer confidence is still okay, though. It's been moving back and forth for the last 3 years. It hasn't collapsed. At least this is the Conference Board's measure. And the reason why is that, for the most part, consumers have said that their current conditions are okay, even though they have some worries from month to month about the future. If we go to the next slide, we can see here the reason why consumers in general have been fine with the present situation. It's because they are working. And indeed, this is a labor market differential. So it's the number of of workers or people, consumers saying that jobs are hard to get versus jobs are easy to get. Now, it's definitely on the downtrend, but as long as we're above zero, it means consumers, for the most part, think that they can find work. Next slide, please. And when we ask consumers point blank about recession, it looks like they're not as concerned about recession as of July of this year compared to May of 2023. Now, I would ignore the numbers because we started this survey in July of 2022. So we don't know what the bottom is. So this is all relative, but at least relative to last spring, consumers are not thinking that a recession's on the way. And in the next slide, we'll see that most CEOs don't think that either. So if you look at the red bar, so that's last year around this time, over 80% of CEOs of very large companies said, yes, a recession's coming. And then if we look at the purple bar, that's the third quarter of this year, and only about 33% are thinking that a recession's coming. So that's important. So if companies don't think a recession is coming, then they're less likely to let go of their workers. And that's something that you need certainly to have a true recession. Recession is not just defined by 2 quarters of negative GDP growth. It's defined by the entire economy in terms of the labor market growth, inflation, expectations from consumers and businesses. Next slide, please. So here's our forecast for growth. We think that real GDP is going to slow in the second half of this year, but we should start seeing stronger growth towards the end of next year. And this is based upon the fact that, yes, the Fed has raised interest rates very aggressively over a short period of time. But there are lags. It takes time for the Fed's actions to flow through the economy. So immediately the housing market responded to higher interest rates. Then businesses cut back on investment, and consumers are kind of the last piece of the puzzle. But as long as consumers are working, many of them still feel confident with putting money on their credit cards. And while we see that as a risk, certainly for consumers and also the financial institutions that issue those cards, consumers are saying, well, as long as I have a job, I know I can pay down at least the minimum and I can continue to spend. So that's why we don't have a recession, because we think consumers are probably still going to spend. Um, and that should help prevent us from seeing negative GDP growth. Now, are there risks that we could see negative GDP growth? Always. But we think that for the most part, the economy is okay. And it's not raging, but it's certainly growing at a reasonable rate. Next slide. So let's talk about the labor market quickly. So in the July employment report, we saw that there were 114,000 payroll additions in the month. So that's smaller than what we saw in the second quarter of this year and the first quarter of this year, um, and certainly over the last few years. So, and when you look at the 114 compared to the period between, I would say, 2010 and the recession, which is that really big drop, 114 is also a little bit smaller. But we have to realize there's special factors going on for both of those time periods. So as you can see, there's a giant drop in employment in 2020 because of the pandemic shutdowns. And then we spent several years getting back to normal in terms of the number of people who are working. And so it's kind of like a bathtub. You fill up the water really, you run the faucet really hard when you're trying to fill it up. But as you get closer to the rim, as you fill up the bathtub, you don't need to run the water as hard. And so I think that's what's going on. And also we have to remember, between the Great Recession and the pandemic, it took about 10 years for the US economy to recover and for employment to return to a level that looks somewhat normal for the economy. So that's why you see all those really large growth rates. Now, can we see zero payrolls? Certainly. But I think the issue is, does the unemployment rate rise? So let's go to the next slide. This is just showing us that for the most part, the payroll gains we're seeing are from a core set of industries: leisure and hospitality, healthcare and social assistance, government, and also I would toss in construction. And we know that those industries are suffering from some pretty severe labor shortages because many workers are retiring. And also, many workers are not really willing to go in some of the industries where you have to physically show up to work because they like remote and hybrid work. So this is a concern, certainly for many people, that you don't have this broad distribution of payroll gains, but nonetheless, it's positive. Next slide, please. And this is what I mean this is the total number of people on payrolls. This is just the number. So these are hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people rather. And you can see that yes, we had a big drop in 2020, but we're almost back on that red arrow, which is an arrow I just drew, which is the trend that we were on just before the pandemic. So I kind of see this as the bathtub getting close to being full. And so you don't need to have big payroll numbers to asymptote to that red line. Next slide. So a big thing is that the unemployment rate has ticked up. But if we look at it historically, it's still very, very low. So last year, the unemployment rate reached 3.4%. And in the latest reading, it's, I think, around 4.2%. Yes, that's a big delta, but you're going from a very, very low number to a low number. It's still the case that most Americans are working who want to work. And even for the July print, we think that there were some special factors going on. If you go to the next slide. So this is the famous SOM rule, where anytime it goes above 0.5 of a percentage point, which it did in July, it often signals a recession. But I actually spoke with Claudia Salm, and she said that this may be a false signal this time around, because when we look at the composition of the unemployed persons in July, it's kind of strange. And if we go to the next slide, you can see here how many people were unemployed by reason. And there was a tremendous number of people who were unemployed in the household survey, people who said, I'm unemployed because they lost their jobs temporarily. So that means they're going to go back to work. So this could reverse. And it could also be the case that Hurricane Beryl had an effect, or any number of things, but it's probably not the case that this is going to persist, these temporary layoffs. The other thing is, we noticed that over the course of this year through July, a lot of the people who are unemployed are actually people who are re-entering the labor market, or they're new to the labor market. So unless you find a job right away, you're going to be counted as unemployed. But the good news is that people are finding jobs. Next slide, please. There's still a labor shortage problem. How do I know this? So this is job openings from the JOLT survey. And you can see that the latest reading is still pretty well above where we were just before the pandemic. So this is a measure of labor demand. So companies are still demanding people. And again, a lot of those companies that are demanding workers are the ones that are suffering from labor shortages. Next slide, please. And the reason why we're experiencing labor shortages, there are lots of reasons, and we wrote about this. One is certainly the fact that birth rates are lower, which comes from various reasons, especially the fact that children aren't dying, so you don't need to have 10 children, but it's also very expensive to raise children. But here you can see that baby boomers are retiring. It started back in 2010, and you can see that blue line just completely changes slope. And then the slope steepened again during the pandemic. And this is going to continue over the next 5 to 10 years. So as companies are losing workers to retirement, the next slide, we're seeing that they're less likely to let people go. So this is large firms, and that's pretty much what I cover. But even among small firms, they're not necessarily saying they're looking to let go of a lot of people. And certainly if you look at this chart, even if you go back to the beginning of 2023, when everyone was afraid that a recession was coming, you would expect the red line to spike. And it didn't. Most companies either continued to hire on the margins, or they just held on to their workers. It's called retention in HR, and economists call it hoarding. And because companies are hoarding workers, we didn't have a recession last year because more people were still working, and they also had residual money from the stimulus checks. And even now the stimulus checks are over, most people are still working. So as long as people are working and they don't feel threatened that they're going to get laid off, then they continue to spend. Next slide, please. And then also this tells me that baby boomers retiring is affecting labor force participation. So here I split it up between people 16 to 64. So their labor force participation has recovered from the pandemic and it's above it. But the light blue line, those are people age 65 and under. That group is still struggling to go back to the level of participation that we saw before the pandemic. And it may or may not get there because you're going to continue to have baby boomers retiring for some time. Next slide. So with all that, we think the unemployment rates is going to rise a little bit. Maybe it'll get to around 4.5%. But it'll probably max out there again because you still have these residual labor shortages and you still have the ongoing fact that people are retiring and companies are concerned about holding on to their best talent. And also, they don't want to let people go and then have to bring them back 9 months later at a much higher price point. So let's go to the next slide. So just a few more. So here's inflation. And I saw somebody in the chat say, well, Dana keeps saying inflation's going to be lower and lower. And everybody else has been saying that, even the Fed, right? So what's been happening is that inflation in the first quarter of this year kind of stalled out. And then it picked back up again in terms of slowing in the second quarter. And we think it's still going to continue to slow. And we've been calling for a while that we'll probably get back to 2% in the middle of next year. So let's understand really quickly what is driving inflation. Next slide. So sorry, this is tiny. I think we're going to send this out. But this basically shows you from 2022 until very recently what's been driving consumer price inflation. So back in 2022, everything was rising. But you can see on the good side that it's really shrunken. And really what's driving goods inflation is food and energy, which is a big deal for consumers. People have to eat and they need to drive to work. But the good news is that some of that inflation is being offset by cheaper prices for goods like cars and furniture. So that's important. So for the most part, it's offsetting. Are consumers still worried about inflation? Less so about the rate of change, but they're still complaining about the price level. Yes, prices are high. And it's only the case that some prices like cars and furniture are falling, but most prices are not. So where's most of the inflation coming from if goods are offsetting? It's coming from services, right? So, and the biggest chunk of that is shelter costs. So that's another reason why consumers are upset because rents are expensive. And also, if you want to buy a home, it's expensive. But the good news is that we're seeing some shrinkage in the housing share, but everything else is, I think, related to the fact that wages are elevated. Again, because companies are not wanting to let go of workers, but they have to pay money to keep them. And they're passing those higher labor costs onto the consumer. Next slide. I think I have only a couple more slides. So this is the good news. Housing costs which is the yellow line, and the light blue line are going to continue to slow, but it's going to take time. And probably next year we'll have an issue with those prices in the inflation rising. But again, it takes about 18 months for action in home prices to be reflected in the PCE and the CPI. So that's why it's taking so long. Next slide. And the other thing I mentioned is that wages are elevated. So here we have wages and salaries and also benefits. And the growth rates for both of these are higher than what we've seen since before the Great Recession. So this is super high for a lot of companies. They're not going to absorb it, so they're passing it on to the consumer. So wages are still putting upward pressure on services prices. Next slide, please. And when we ask CEOs in the same survey how much you're going to raise wages, it's the case that most of them are still planning to raise wages by more than 3% over the next 12 months. And that's a lot because usually before the pandemic, on average, companies would raise wages by 2 to 3%. Next slide. So with all that, we think inflation is still going to trend back to 2%, but it's going to take some time. We'll probably get there around the middle of next year. Next slide. This is my final slide. So what do we think about the Fed? Well, we do think the Fed's going to start cutting rates in September because they believe that their goals of stable prices and also maximum employment are very close to being achieved. And you don't have to see inflation at 2% before you start cutting rates. So they've signaled that they're probably going to start cutting rates in September. And we think that ultimately, between now and the next year, they'll probably cut rates down to something close to 3%. That's the Fed funds rate. That red line is what they were suggesting in June. We'll get an update in September. And that I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great. Dana, if I can, I'd love to ask you a couple questions before we go to our next guest. Because it's an election year, does that mean going into a year like this that you would maybe expect that the economy can continue to grow all the way through November?
Well, our forecast has the economy slowing. And so the thing is that when we actually do track what consumers are thinking about elections, and politics in general. So they perked up in terms of saying politics matter. But in terms of the election, they don't really start paying attention oftentimes until October. And even this year, even with all the exciting things that have been happening in our survey, they're still tracking right about where we were in previous elections, where they weren't that interested until we got really close. So I think, and oftentimes there's some October surprise, something that you don't expect that happens that influences the election. We've seen that a lot. But again, as the former guest talked about, it's not just the economy, right? It's also lots of social issues that weigh into people's decisions. So I think psychologically, people might feel better if the Fed starts cutting rates, even though they're probably going to cut rates by, 75 to 100 basis points by the end of this year. That's not a whole lot, but psychologically it'll make people feel better. And already we're seeing mortgage rates falling, which also makes people feel better. Okay, the price of the house is still elevated, but at least I can get a break on the mortgage.
Do you think the Fed will worry at all about being seen as political if they cut rates as we're heading this close to an election? Is there going to be pressure on the Fed that might give them pause about a rate cut in September?
There's always pressure on the Fed, but they ignore it. Their mandate is not fiscal policy or politics. Their mandate is monetary policy and making sure that the U.S. banking system and financial system is working. So they're going to do what they need to do. Chair Powell said a few weeks ago, and it's the same thing he always says, that the elections will not have any bearing on what the Fed does with regards to monetary policy. Now, there was one Fed president, the president of the Bank of Chicago, did express, I didn't read the whole thing, but I just saw like a snippet that he expressed some concern about acting right before the election. But that's his personal view. The Fed's view is that it will do what it needs to do, regardless of the election.
Great. Well, we'll come back with more questions from the audience after our final speaker. So now I would like to go back to where we began. Dr. Nasia Safdar was gracious enough to offer her expertise in the early days of the pandemic. She was our first guest, a very frequent guest in the beginning. Thankfully, we haven't had you on a lot lately. I think that's good news. But I did think that, so much has occurred related to our healthcare system, how the pandemic was handled. We've now had enough time to maybe process a little bit more of the data and the variation in experiences among US states and among countries around the world. So it might be a great time to have a little bit of a retrospective and also hear from Dr. Safdar, where are we headed with COVID and infectious diseases, generally speaking. So Dr. Safdar, thanks for coming back and sharing your insights.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Let's go to our slides. And when you look at this slide, I'm sure this will strike many people as being deja vu. This is now how many of waves we've had, but we're seeing this again in the middle of the summer, which is also a bit of a surprise when it comes to what is conventionally considered to be a respiratory virus. But the test positivity rate continues to rise. Emergency department visits continue to go up. We're seeing a little bit of increase in severity in terms of hospitalizations and deaths as well, although it, of course, is nowhere near what it was when we first started out. And all of that attenuation is in all likelihood a combination of people getting vaccinated and or having had COVID and therefore generating some immunity. I don't think that this is the sort of thing that is ever going to really go away. And I think that we have found an uneasy coexistence with SARS-CoV-2. It continues to surprise us in terms of how fast the virus continues to evolve. And we always seem to be in a state of trying to catch up. But I think we at least have a reasonable sense of where things will go in the future, including the fact that it will continue to have these ups and downs. If we go to the next slide, now the single biggest thing that has turned the tide for COVID-19 globally and in the US has been the fact that very early on, relatively speaking, there came about these highly effective vaccines, and there were a number of them. They all worked really well. They couldn't protect people fully against mild disease, but it made a big difference to hospitalizations and it made a big difference to deaths. So it's a little bit disappointing with the background of that information that vaccination rates continue to remain flat and low, and if anything, are expected to trend maybe even downward going on in the future. You can see that in this graph, the age group that has the highest rates of vaccination, which is about 40%, are people over the age of 65. And that makes sense because at that age, you're likely to have, and beyond, you might have some comorbidities, you might be more likely to be immunocompromised. And so you want to do everything you can to lower your chances of getting severe COVID. But COVID does not really, thus far has not discriminated terribly when it comes to age. And children have suffered from it. Young adults with comorbidities have suffered from it. And the general public, of course, with no comorbidities have also had severe COVID. So for us to see vaccination rates that have flattened around 20%, and this is the 2023-24 updated COVID-19 vaccine, is a bit disappointing. Now, you might say that, some of this is vaccination fatigue. This is likely to be a yearly vaccine. And at some point, people will say, well, I've had COVID a number of times. I'm probably have generated some natural immunity. And do I really have to keep taking these vaccines? So I think understanding some of the reasons behind these low vaccination rates is going to continue to be important in the future as well. If we go to the next slide, what we can see is that only about 14% of eligible children receive the recommended 23-24 COVID-19 vaccine. And we already talked about how with adults, it's about 20 to 22%. So if this were not to have any consequences, that would be one thing. And one could say that, yes, getting vaccinated is a great thing. But if the rates are low and it's not having a major consequence on the health of the public, that's something that we have time to tackle. But you can see that for people that had to be hospitalized because they had severe COVID-19, only 11% had received the most recent vaccine. And so right away, you can see that the effect of the vaccine in preventing hospitalization and deaths is pretty dramatic. Now, of course, it's sometimes hard to predict who will get severe disease and who will not. And if the danger is sort of far off in the future and it's somewhat nebulous, one might be tempted to say, I'll just take my chances. But for people in the health system that are caring for individuals who are very sick and have severe COVID, it's very disheartening to see that something that could have prevented that severity was not taken up. Historically, and I think continuing to be the case, is that vaccination rates have been lowest in rural areas, which is likely a function of access, as well as among people of color, which has a number of reasons behind it, including access issues as well. And I think we know that because the vaccination rates are highest among wealthier people who have health insurance and live in urban areas and find it easy to get access to the vaccine. Next slide. So this is a situation where practice sort of went further than the evidence did. You all will remember that for several years when the pandemic began, there was a lot of uncertainty about modes of transmission, about the contagiousness, which seemed to get more and more transmissible as the virus continued to evolve. And so for several days, people had to be in isolation. If you were exposed to COVID, you had to quarantine until you knew whether you were going to get it or not, so that you didn't infect other people. And while some of that is still the case, very much so in health systems and for healthcare workers, but in the community, people, I think, started to get tired of the whole idea of being in isolation for longer than they absolutely had to. And over time, policy evolved to treat SARS-CoV-2 as more like a respiratory common cold or influenza-like virus, meaning that the isolation guidelines were updated to state that as long as you didn't have fever and you were continuing to improve, that you didn't have to isolate you could go out in public, but you should take extra precautions for as long as you have symptoms, which might mean a combination of avoiding congregated activities or testing yourself frequently to see when you became negative with the antigen test, and or using masks or any combination of those. And so when this started to just become very widespread in the community, the CDC then updated its guidelines to reflect what you see on the slide there. This does mean that there is a trade-off between people who might be out in public and still be contagious, because it's not at all clear that day 5 is when you completely lose the ability to transmit the virus, although the risk is highest in the first few days of illness and even before you become symptomatic. So there are some trade-offs here, but I think those trade-offs were deemed necessary in order to give people a chance of living a somewhat normal life and going back to school and going back to work. But I think that we should all recognize that you do take a bit of a chance when you do that. And so masking and frequent testing is a good way of mitigating against that ongoing transmission risk. Next slide. So these are the latest vaccine recommendations. The principal tenet of vaccination is that we should make it as convenient as possible for people to get. So tying it to the influenza vaccine that most people are used to getting on a yearly basis is a good idea. It is a killed vaccine, so there's no risk for people to get it. So you can get both at the same visit. It is likely that this will be a yearly vaccine. I mean, we've already seen that. Every time there's a new major change in the virus with the variant, the vaccine has had to be updated to reflect that. And part of this is, I think, is playing a bit of catch up because it takes months for the vaccine to be developed. And in between, if the virus evolves and the variant becomes a different one, then you lose a little bit of effectiveness. Now, the most common one that's circulating now is KP3 and its little subvariants or daughter variants. But KP2, which is closely related to JN1, this alphabet soup of the variants, the vaccine will be effective against those. But of course, will it be as effective as it would be if it were created specifically for the most relevant variant that is circulating now? I don't think we can know that until it's out there. And so for Novavax, for instance, we've got the JN1 variant, and for the other two, for Moderna and Pfizer, we've got the KP2, which is a slightly more recent variant. They all are likely to be effective, but I think the number will likely be lower now that we're seeing KP3 responsible for the vast majority of cases. Now, besides the fact that the COVID-19 vaccination will protect people against acute COVID-19 illness, there is also emerging evidence to suggest that it will reduce the chance of people getting long COVID, which is something that we are only now starting to really get a good handle on in terms of understanding. Still a long way to go to fully understand what the syndrome is. But I think that a sobering realization came in the last couple of years is that SARS-CoV-2 is not just a respiratory virus. Its effects, even when you have recovered from the initial illness, can affect the entire organ system throughout the body. And long COVID, 400 million people around the world are affected with it, and it takes a long time to recover from it. Now, some of this would be easier to take if we knew what was causing it. And there are a lot of theories. These are just 4 of them. It may be that it's not one or the other. It may be that there's a combination of situations here. So for instance, there's a theory which has been borne out in people who are immunocompromised, such as those who have had transplants, for instance, that there is a persistent reservoir of virus. And we've seen that in people that repeatedly get treated for SARS-CoV-2, and yet when you do cultures and testing, they still have viable live virus in high quantities. You can keep it at bay for a little bit, but once the treatment is stopped, it starts to surface again. And that in all likelihood is due to the inadequate immune response of the host. So that this is important because whatever treatment interventions you would want to do, you would want to target towards the pathogenesis of long COVID. Some of the other theories are whether there's reactivation of other latent viruses that may make it more likely for people to get the symptoms of long COVID. There is also the disarray of the host immune system, which might be more hyperactive rather than less, as was described in the first theory, and actually cause a higher autoimmune response, which then means that antibodies are produced that target and attack a person's own organs and tissues. And finally, we know that severe COVID in particular does a lot of damage to the lungs, to the heart, to other parts of the human system. And so that organ damage then will manifest in persistent symptoms that may take a long time for people to recover from. So this, even more so than acute COVID, I think is the next wave of what's going to cause some anxiety and a lot of lines of research inquiry until we can figure some of this out. Next slide. And the reason that it's important is because there is no pharmacological single treatment for long COVID at the moment. And so it's a lot of multidisciplinary management of symptoms. And depending upon what kinds of symptoms one has, the treatment is likely to be very different. But you can see it ranges all the way from cardiac to neurological to smell and taste symptoms. There's often the need for olfactory training. It's very distressing for people to not be able to smell or taste their food. You can live with it in the short period of time with acute COVID, but it's very difficult to come to terms with it when it's a symptom of long COVID. Sleep hygiene and insomnia and other sleep symptoms also keep people from feeling their best long after their acute symptoms of COVID have disappeared. One of the challenges of long COVID is just simply the recognition that one has it. As you recover from a severe respiratory illness, you don't know to what extent what you're feeling is just a remnant of what you had, or whether you're evolving to this whole new syndrome. And so for that reason, many people will not seek medical attention until several months have gone by and they realize that they haven't gone back to their baseline before they had COVID. And that's part of the reason that I think almost certainly we are underestimating the amount of long COVID that is out there. If you go to the next slide. So here are some other listing of symptoms. The one thing that is important for long COVID is that, most of the time when people are recovering from an illness, we say that you should exercise and you should try to get back into a routine that you were before. And while that still may be the case for many people, with long COVID, you get what's called post-exertional malaise. So your symptoms actually feel worse after exertion. And so you really have to pace yourself very carefully to make sure that you're increasing your physical activity in a manner that supports your improvement and doesn't cause it to go backward. This is very similar to other post-infectious syndromes, which may offer some clues in terms of treatment options. But at the moment, while there are some things in trials, there isn't an effective treatment for long COVID other than preventing COVID by way of vaccinations. And if you can't prevent it, then treating it soon and effectively with some of the oral antivirals out there. One thing that's also under-recognized is the higher executive level functioning issues, where people feel that they've recovered as far as their respiratory symptoms go, but they have concentration, memory, brain fog issues that is very alien to them because these were typically high functioning people before. And so trying to come to terms with it and understand what's going on has been part of the challenges of managing long COVID. Next slide. So there was a global debriefing. I think the US is not necessarily the leader in the field when it comes to debriefing and to do sort of crisis assessment after the fact. We're now 4 years into it. We feel we're over the worst of it in terms of the acute mortality and morbidity that SARS-CoV-2 caused. We have effective vaccinations, we have effective treatments, but it does take time for people to come through a crisis and come to a new baseline, which often is not the same baseline as when you started out with. So this Lancet Commission report, which was on a global scale, found that there were a number of, not surprisingly, some of these we all lived through, but there were a number of failures in all aspects of management of this pandemic. And those are really important to think about and to wonder what interventions one might want to do now, because it almost is inevitable that there would be another pandemic in the future, whenever that may be. So some of the things you can see was the lack of notification, the lack of coordination, a shortfall of global funding. I think number 2 here was particularly relevant for us in infection control, which was delays in understanding transmission pathways and figuring out the transmission potential of this virus. And if you go to the next slide, you can see that the other issues were the lack of PPE, the lack of timely, accurate, and systematic data on surveillance. So if you think about the 4 S's when it comes to management of any kind of transmissible disease, what are the staff, the stuff, the space, the systems that are needed for effective management? And in all of those, essentially we failed during the SARS-CoV-2, the worst of the times. So this offers us a good framework and a roadmap to think about how to make systems different to combat things in the future. Number 9, I think, is one in particular that we continue to see fairly rampant systematic disinformation out there. And unless we find a good way to tackle that, I think we will always be at a little bit of disadvantage, because that sort of disinformation travels much faster than true science does. This may have been my last slide, I think. Oh, yes. So let's talk about the future of SARS-CoV-2. So I think what we're going to see is we'll continue to see these wavelets. They might not be in terms of these giant waves that we saw in the beginning because of the attenuation with some interventions and vaccines. But it's going to continue to be that there'll be ups and downs. I think the respiratory virus season will continue to see that's where it'll be at its worst potentially. But even the rest of the year, we're going to see it like we are now. There is exploration of different routes of administration of the vaccines, particularly the intranasal route, which might make it easier for people to get them. I think we have to focus on therapeutics for long COVID, and then really to do predictive studies and biomarkers to determine who's most vulnerable for severe disease, besides the obvious that we see with immune compromise and vulnerability to long COVID. I think given how our society has responded thus far, I think in the future, any major role of non-pharmaceutical interventions is unlikely. I think in small pockets, you might see people still wanting to mask and social distance, but I think as a society, those are not things that we seem to be having an appetite for. Next slide.
I think that's it. I think we're done. So Nasia, a couple questions came in about masks and vaccinations, and I'm just kind of roll them together and build on something you mentioned, which is, someone asked whether wearing a mask can prevent me from getting COVID, or is it more to prevent me from spreading it? Someone else wondered about the adverse effects of vaccinations, and masks and vaccination side effects are things that, I see there's a lot of information going around about that. Some of it may be misinformation. I was wondering, what do you think are some of the most harmful pieces of misinformation about COVID or its transmission or its impact that you're aware of?
I think the biggest one is that the whole thing is a conspiracy theory and the pandemic doesn't even exist and all of that. That was a big disinformation and continues to be the case. But beyond that, for reasonable people, even there, the information that is trickling through social media, some websites that are commonly used, it's really quite difficult to distinguish between what is fact and what is sometimes cleverly fictionalized stuff. And so an example of that is people thinking that the vaccine will actually give you COVID, for instance. This is not a new thing. People have been wondering about that with, say, influenza. Took decades of education to convince them that that was not the case with the killed vaccine. But with the COVID vaccine, that led to a lot of people not wanting to take that in the future, or that the side effects of the vaccines were worse than what you might expect to get from the disease itself, which again, certainly no vaccine is completely free of adverse effects. But when we think about the relative trade-offs and the risks and benefits, the risks of getting COVID with its protein complications in people at high risk are far higher than what you might get from adverse effects of the vaccine. But of course, I think these are individual decisions that people have to make. I think for masking, people like to have it all or none, that it either has to work 100% of the time or it doesn't work at all, when in reality, most interventions in the biomedical field, nothing is really 100%. So I view masks as something that adds to protection. It's worth doing both to protect yourself from getting it and also to transmit it to other people if you have it. But just like a raincoat, it's not going to keep you dry in every storm.
Yeah, for the conspiracy theorists, I read The Economist regularly, and when COVID was, really in its full bloom, let's say, they would have the charts on excess deaths by country. And as you know, the law of large numbers really helps us to be able to predict how many people will die in a country in a given year, just based on demographics. It's very little variation and not very big errors typically. And there is no doubt that the COVID-19 episode caused a lot of excess deaths around the world. And, so anyone who thinks it wasn't a real thing, I would encourage them to take a look at that data.
Absolutely.
Which is produced by many different sources, but undeniably powerful data. So I'd like to bring all of our guests back. We're at time, but I have kind of a question for each guest. to kind of cap it off. So Charles, as we sit today, who is in the driver's seat to win the presidential election in November of 2024? Who do you give the edge to as we sit here right now?
I give the edge to the voters, and that's a joke, but it's also utterly sincere. Handicapping who's going to win, I think, is a fool's errand. As close as our recent presidential elections have been nationally as well as in the swing states, I don't believe you can have a reliable forecasting model for who's going to win. I think the shift to Harris has boosted Democratic fortunes considerably over where they would have been for Biden. But that shift hasn't necessarily reduced Trump's support at all. And so for that reason, I think the best answer is it's in the hands of the voters who will decide this election. But exactly how and which side wins, give me a quarter and I'll flip it for you.
Great answer by a man who polls the voters for a living. Thank you. Dana, I'm going to ask you, is there going to be a soft landing, or are we headed to a recession within the next 6 months?
Soft landing means getting inflation back to 2% without massive layoffs and extensive periods of negative GDP. I think we can achieve that. Will the economy slow? Yes. Will we have recession? I don't think we will.
And Nazia, when will we stop testing to see if we have COVID and just treat it like some other viral disease?
I think many people have already come to that conclusion. I think the people that still should test are those that would benefit from antivirals. Similarly to, you would want to know if you have influenza because you can get treatment for it. And so with the availability of Paxlovid, you would want to test in those circumstances. And hard as it may be, it seems like there's still about 25% of the population that have never had COVID that are called novids. And there was an editorial that said, if you've never had COVID, please explain yourself. And so we still don't know what's going on there.
Would you tell them it's safe to come out now?
I think at some point you have to.
All right. Well, thank you all. There's a reason you're all popular guests here, and you showed that again tonight. Great topics, great insights. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And I'd like to thank our audience. 100 editions. We'll keep going. We'll be back in early September with another edition. I also really want to thank our production team for giving up many Tuesday nights to make sure that we could continue to do this 100 times in 4 years. It's been a lot of fun for me to have this kind of connection with alumni and also with our faculty and alumni experts on all these topics. Very educational and really a great experience. So we'll be back on Tuesday, September 10th, and we'll have more experts, topic to be determined. And we'll look forward to seeing you then. And until then, on Wisconsin.